moving on to
different types of grief. The answer to that is yes, there are many types of grief. Now, if we look at, the different types, we have the collective grief, then we have the traumatic, we have the complicated. So, just a quick overview of what is collective grief. It's, you know, um, when a whole community or a country or globally, in the case of COVID-19, um, that we are grieving, that we are in some degree of mourning, and wars, the Holocaust, and events leading to mass casualties and national tragedy is when people experience collective grief. We have traumatic grief, and that's a strong grief reaction that doesn't subside but lasts for a long period. Um, Normal grief responses are experienced in combination with traumatic distress suffered. Um, the distress that they suffer can be extreme and impair their daily functioning and cause, things like post-traumatic stress disorder. We heard of a lot of the soldiers that went to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, returning with PTSD because of what they had experienced themselves and what they had witnessed around them. A lot of death, a lot of destruction. Um, and it might be helpful to just go over a case study for traumatic grief. And I wanted to share with you a client that I had a number of years ago, where he had been instructed to go and pick up a van that he and his colleague shared for, to do their job. The client picked up the van. He had a few errands to run that day. The van had been left on a double yellow line on a Friday evening. So the first thing he did on a Monday morning when he got into the office is to go and pick up this van. He'd driven the van around, did his errands, took the best part of a day. And when he went back to the depot to return the van, he, kind of noticed that things had been moving around quite a bit in the back of the van when he was running his errands. So when he opened the back of the van, he noticed that his colleague had hung himself in the back of the van, and this poor man had been driving around with his dead colleague in the back. So he had been traumatized on so many different levels, and he had experienced a great deal of guilt for not knowing that his colleague was in the back. Of course, rationally, there's no reason for him to know a thing like that, but he couldn't reconcile the fact that he had been driving around with the dead person in the back, and that dead person happened to be his colleague. So he experienced things like flashbacks, um, feeling that he was in the room with him, feeling that feeling extreme feelings of guilt, and acute sense of loss, and also having dreams. So this is an example of what a complicated grief might look like, and it's working with the client to talk through what he had experienced, and to gradually work through the guilt and some degree of desensitization, because his he was unable to negotiate that loss even after several months. So anticipatory grief is when you have somebody who's terminally ill, and perhaps that grieving process starts before they have passed away. And sometimes people feel a great deal of guilt about that they are grieving the death of someone before they have died. And after they pass away, often they can be left feeling quite conflicted, and even, scolding themselves because perhaps their reaction to the death wasn't as intense as perhaps other people's. And when they look at other people, and perhaps the reason for that is they have been working through their grief for quite some time. And I guess the other important thing about anticipatory grief is that even when you know that something like this is going to happen, that they're going to pass away at some stage, there is still some degree of shock, because you can kind of anticipate that it's going to happen, but when it actually happens, it's still a shock, it's still a surprise. And some of those normal grief responses are also triggered. So disenfranchised grief is grief that, for whatever reason, they are made to feel, or they feel as though their loss is invalidated or insignificant in comparison to perhaps other griefs. So other grievers. And the cause for disenfranchised grief can occur from, a variety of things like suicide, overdose, HIV, AIDS, drunk driving, death of a pet, death of a colleague, perhaps, miscarriages. And it makes the person who is experiencing disenfranchised grief feel as though their loss or grief is not accepted, by their culture, by their society, by their support group, or their peers or their networks. Um, and I guess it's really important to kind of use case studies so we can see what it looks like in actual life, in reality, how disenfranchised grief and all these other grieving styles really manifest itself. So if you perhaps are to notice it notice certain things in somebody else, then you can perhaps let them know that some of these responses aren't sort of normal. The case study for disenfranchised grief is that of a palliative nurse in her late 50s. She was considered the other woman by her partner's children because they were from a previous relationship, and they had never accepted this client. Having been through having been together for several years, and nursing him through his illness, um, she found it very difficult to accept when she was shunned by his children at the funeral. She wasn't allowed to make any of the decisions regarding the funeral arrangements, and she hadn't, as her partner hadn't amended his will. She was traumatized by what she had witnessed whilst nursing him. I suppose the difference here is that when she's treated other people who have been, at the end of life, there wasn't that emotional connection or that personal connection to them. She was there to do a job. Here, she is, involved with this person. So therefore, she's unable to separate her personal feelings from, the tasks that she has to do to support him through his illness. And when you have something like a body being cremated, sometimes people find it very difficult to locate the deceased. And in this situation, the client found it very difficult to locate her partner, because there wasn't a gravestone a place that she could go and offload her grief. He was cremated, therefore he didn't really, there wasn't a place for him. And she didn't get that sense of release. She felt very stuck in her sadness, tried to return to work, but felt she was unable to go anywhere near the office because it reminded her too much of death. Um, And then her partner's children were kind enough to allow the client to have a pendant made out of his ashes. And she wore this chain all the time because she felt close to him, and she felt, you know, physically that this chain was close to her heart and he was close to her heart. And we worked together for many sessions. And then after the 16th session, the client began to show signs of returning um, back to those initial feelings of despair and sadness. And that was due to having, you know, physically having this necklace and putting it around her. And, you know, we tend to make associations with objects, with things, and we tend to put certain meanings on them. And she had definitely put some real emphasis onto this pendant. And when she wore it, she was, you know, holding those feelings of grief and sadness. Um, so that's I thought was a good example of what disenfranchised grief looks like in real life. It's very complicated, and yeah, it's very, very difficult. Um, just very briefly, another example of disenfranchised grief. Um, so a father lost his son to suicide after his son was charged with rape. The father discovered the son's body. He and his mother were aware that he had suicidal tendencies, and did everything they could to prevent him from killing himself. And I suppose when somebody's made the decision to take their own life, there's very little that you can do to prevent them. You know, they will do what they feel is necessary. So his son had been, you know, dismissed from his course. He was training to become a doctor. You know, he had a promising future. He was dismissed from his university, and he felt as though his life wasn't going anywhere, and the son couldn't reconcile um, what he had done and the consequences. So he took himself into the woods and hung himself from a tree. And his poor father went looking for him, found him in the woods, and discovered the body. And, you know, there's just several layers of trauma there already. And he had this deep sense of sorrow that he was unable to save his son. Not only sorrow, there was, you know, several layers of guilt that on some level, that he had failed his son and he wasn't able to stop him from taking his own life. He was traumatized by what he'd seen. You know, there's post-traumatic stress disorder that was, you know, developing. He also developed a morbid sense of humor because that was the only way he could process some of what had happened. And this morbid sense of humor that he developed wasn't appreciated by his family. So they couldn't understand him. You know, the family unit fell apart. He stopped talking to his children. His wife left him. So not only was he dealing with the grief of losing his son under such traumatic circumstances, his loss was just compounded. Um, the case was popularized, you know, the case was in the media, so the client felt shameful for for his son's actions, and so he developed a morbid sense of humor, and the family disintegrated. The client lost his wife. The loss was compounded. The case was in the media, and the client felt really shameful for his son's actions. Um, you know, he felt stigmatized and also felt this real conflict because how, on the one hand, he has his son who he really loves and cares for, and, you know, gave quite a lot of his life to raise this kid, and now how does he kind of grieve for a rapist? So that's another example of disenfranchised grief. And then we have things like chronic grief, and this is a strong grief reaction that doesn't subside, but lasts over a long period of time. Um, I guess, just to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like in real life. So an example of chronic grief is that of a lady who lost her 9-year-old son after a tragic accident that took place one day when they went for a picnic in the park. They'd found a lovely tree. They set themselves up. They sat under that tree, having their picnic, and it was a freak accident where one of the branches broke off from the tree and fell on the son, killing him instantly. The parents just couldn't reconcile that loss. They couldn't come to terms with, how he was absolutely fine and they were having a wonderful day, and then, absolutely the worst unimaginable thing happened. So they blamed themselves as parents. They blamed each other for not doing things differently on the day. And as parents, they should have been more careful. That's what they thought. That unhelpful thinking set in, a lot of self-blame, a lot of self-deprecating beliefs set in. Um, and they had other children. And but having other children didn't serve as a distraction as it might do for other parents. For this set of parents, every milestone the other children achieved, they were reminded of what the son they had lost has. They were reminded of everything that he would never achieve, and how they could never forgive themselves as parents um, for what had happened. Unfortunately, the couple's relationship fell apart as the children grew older. They left home, and the client was left with her grief, and she would refer to her grief as being one that she will never be able to reconcile, because it was completely unnatural for her to lose her son before she died. And she would describe herself as having died on the day that he died. And she, couldn't move past her guilt, because to move past her guilt would mean to acknowledge that, he was gone, and to move on without him. So she stayed with her guilt. She chose to stay with her guilt. And there was some degree of comfort in that guilt, because she, through that guilt, was able to attach herself, find some sort of attachment to her son. And that's one example of chronic grief. The other example is of a mother. She had a daughter already, and it was a normal pregnancy, but and she was eager to give her daughter a sibling. So she conceived, and quite early on in the pregnancy, they knew that um, the baby that they were having would have some difficulties, some deformities, but they weren't fully aware of the extent of those complications. They got to around 7 months, and the doctor said that it was very risky to give birth to her child. So they could, several months into the pregnancy, they realized that this baby had deformities, and um, they weren't aware of the full extent of the deformities, but they knew they were quite significant. Um, they then were told that the baby would inevitably die after being born. They had the option of aborting the baby, because perhaps it would be the kinder thing to do. To give birth to this baby would mean that he would eventually die, but die quite a painful death. So the client decided to have the abortion, but gave birth to the baby, so she was able to hold her son before handing him back. She named him. She spent some time with him, and she really connected with her baby. She came to see me a year later, after having delivered her son, she was now pregnant again. And she said that she was really struggling to find any joy in her day-to-day life. She was overwhelmed with feelings of sadness and grief. And we looked at, a year on, what was causing her to feel those intense feelings, well, acute grief that you might experience in the first, couple of days, couple of weeks, perhaps even the first month or two. After several sessions of exploring what this grief was about, we were able to identify that she didn't want to let go of her grief, because the grief is the very thing that was keeping her son close to her. To let go of that grief would be letting go of him. So she had attached her grief to being connected with the son that she wasn't able to have. We talked about, how healthy this grief was, and whether it was, something she wanted to work through. After we had that session, she didn't come back, and I got an email from her saying that she has decided to stop with the sessions because it's too much for her to think about leaving this grief behind, because leaving it behind would mean leaving her son in the past, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. So she decided to stay with her grief. Maybe somewhere in the future she might be able to process that, but right now she's just not ready, and she's not going to move forward with that. So that's another really sad story of chronic grief, and how it's intertwined with, yeah. So that's another story. Sorry, that's another example of chronic grief, and how complicated the nature of chronic grief can be.